Welcome. You've found a quiet place to rest tonight. There's nothing you need to do and nowhere you need to be. All you need to do right now is listen and breathe and let your body slowly relax into wherever you are resting. Tonight, we're going to travel back in time together, very far back. Back to a world that was slower, darker, and quieter than the one we live in today. A world without electric lights, without heating systems, without running water or supermarkets, or the small, comfortable certainties that make modern life feel safe and familiar. We're going to spend some time in the Middle Ages, and as we walk through that world together, you can feel your eyes growing heavier and your breathing growing slower, and the sounds of the present world growing quieter and more distant. There's nothing to worry about tonight. Just rest and listen and let the story carry you gently into sleep. The Middle Ages. When people use that phrase, they usually mean the period of European history that stretched roughly from the 5th century to the 15th century. That's a long time, about 1,000 years. And within that enormous span of time, countless people were born and lived their lives and died in a world that was almost unrecognizably different from our own. Tonight, we're not going to talk about kings and battles and great cathedrals. We're going to talk about the quiet, ordinary, everyday experience of a regular person living in medieval Europe. A farmer, a peasant, someone whose name history never recorded, whose life left almost no trace, but who woke up every morning and went to sleep every night in a world that was, by almost any modern standard, extraordinarily hard. We're going to move slowly through that world, through the villages and the fields and the small dark houses, through the cold mornings and the hungry winters and the long exhausting days. And as we move through it, you can let your body relax a little more with each breath. You can let your thoughts grow softer and quieter. And if at any point you drift off to sleep, that's perfectly fine. That's exactly what this is for. So let's begin. Let's close our eyes and imagine. Imagine you are standing at the edge of a very small village, sometime in the middle of the medieval period. Perhaps it is England, perhaps it is France, perhaps it is Germany. It doesn't matter very much, because villages like this one looked very similar across most of Northern and Western Europe. The year might be somewhere around 1200 or 1250. You're standing on the edge of this village in the early morning, just before dawn. The sky is a very deep, very dark blue. Not quite black, but not yet light. There are stars still visible above you, fading slowly as the first pale suggestion of sunrise begins to appear at the horizon. The village is very quiet at this hour. You can hear wind moving through the bare branches of a few oak trees at the edge of the settlement. You can hear, somewhere nearby, the soft sound of animals, cattle perhaps, or pigs. That sound is very close, closer than you might expect, and we'll talk about why in a moment. The air is cold. If it is autumn or winter, which it often felt like it was in medieval Northern Europe, the cold is quite sharp. Not dramatic or dangerous in this moment, just present. A steady, quiet coldness that settles on your skin and reminds you that warmth is something you have to work for, something you have to earn and maintain, something that is never quite guaranteed. The village itself is small. Perhaps 30 or 40 families live here, maybe fewer. The houses are arranged in a loose cluster, not quite a street, not quite a square. They are small. They are very small by the standards of any house you have ever seen. Each one is roughly rectangular, built from whatever materials were locally available. In many parts of England, the walls are made from timber frames filled in with wattle and daub, which is a mixture of woven sticks and mud, sometimes mixed with straw and animal dung to help it bind together and hold its shape. The roofs are thatched, made from bundles of straw or reeds laid in overlapping layers thick enough to keep out at least some of the rain. The floors are earth, just the ground. packed down by years of footsteps, sometimes strewn with rushes or straw to provide a little insulation from the cold that rises up through the soil. There are no windows in these houses, or if there are, they are very small openings in the wall, covered with wooden shutters or sometimes with a piece of oiled cloth or animal membrane stretched thin enough to let in a little grey light while keeping out some of the wind. There is no glass. Glass in this period is extraordinarily expensive, far beyond the reach of any peasant family. The light inside these houses during the day is dim and grey. At night, it is very dark. The only sources of artificial light are tallow candles, which are expensive and burn quickly, or simple rushlights, which are made by soaking dried rushes in animal fat. They give off a faint, wavering glow. They also give off a smell. A low, slightly unpleasant smell of burning fat that you would notice immediately if you stepped inside one of these houses, and that the people who lived there probably no longer noticed at all, having grown up breathing it every day of their lives. Inside the house, a single room, just one room for the entire family. The family might consist of a husband and wife, 3 or 4 children, perhaps an elderly grandparent. All of them live in this one room. They sleep in this room. They eat in this room. During the coldest months of the year, their animals might also share this room. A pig, a few chickens, maybe a goat. The animals are brought inside partly to protect them from theft and predators, and partly because their body heat helps warm the space. The smell inside is what you would expect: rich, earthy, heavy with the presence of many living bodies in a small space. You would find it overwhelming immediately. The people who lived there did not. It was simply what home smelled like. At the center of the room, or sometimes along one wall, there is a hearth. A simple fireplace, often without a chimney, or with only a hole in the roof above it to let the smoke escape. The fire burns low overnight, built from whatever wood or peat was available. Wood was often scarce in the more densely populated parts of medieval Europe, where the forests had been cut back substantially to make room for farmland. Peasant families were typically only allowed to collect fallen wood from the Lord's forest, not to cut living trees, which meant that finding enough fuel for the fire was a constant, ongoing concern. The fire was everything. It was warmth. It was the means of cooking. It was the only light in the room after dark. When it went out, which it did, life became immediately harder, and someone had to go to a neighbor's house to bring back a burning twig or a piece of smoldering peat to relight it, because fire-striking tools were not always reliable, and not every family owned a good set. The morning begins early, very early. In a world without artificial lighting, human sleep patterns were organized around the rhythms of natural light, and in the winter months, darkness lasted a very long time. But work could not wait for full daylight, and so people rose before the sun in all seasons. The first sounds of the morning are the sounds of movement inside these small dark houses. Someone getting up from the sleeping place. Not a bed in most peasant households, not a raised bed with a frame and a mattress. More likely, a straw-filled sack laid on the floor, or on a low wooden platform just above the floor, covered with rough woolen blankets that were thick and heavy but never quite warm enough on the coldest nights. Getting up from this means coming out from whatever warmth the blankets and the bodies of the family had generated overnight, and immediately encountering the cold air of the room. Even if the fire has been tended through the night, the room is cold. Medieval houses were not insulated in any meaningful way. Cold air moved through the gaps in the wattle and daub, through the ill-fitting shutters, through the thatched roof. On winter mornings, you could see your breath inside the house. The first task of the morning is usually to rebuild the fire, to coax the overnight embers back into a proper flame, to add wood or peat, to begin the slow process of warming the room and heating whatever would pass for breakfast. Breakfast in a medieval peasant household is simple to the point of bleakness by modern standards. Pottage, most likely. Pottage is a thick porridge or stew made from whatever is available. Oats, barley, rye, dried peas or beans, whatever vegetables might be in the garden or stored from the autumn harvest. Sometimes a little salt, rarely for most families, any meat. The pottage is cooked in an iron pot hung over the fire, and the same pot, filled with similar ingredients, might be kept going for days at a time, with new ingredients added as old ones are consumed. It is warm. It is filling, more or less. It provides enough energy to work. It is not, by any stretch of imagination, interesting or varied or pleasurable in the way that food is for most people reading or listening to this today. Food in the medieval world was primarily a source of fuel rather than pleasure. Most peasants ate the same things, in the same combinations, day after day, week after week, season after season. The variety that we take completely for granted today, the ability to eat foods from every part of the world, regardless of the season, the experience of a meal as something to look forward to and enjoy, this was entirely absent from the daily lives of most medieval people. What they ate was determined entirely by what they could grow, what they could forage, and what the season allowed. And in the winter months, what they could eat was substantially determined by what they had managed to preserve from the autumn harvest. Preservation in the medieval world meant salt, smoke, and drying. Meat that was slaughtered in the autumn, typically at the end of the grazing season when animals could no longer be fed through the winter, was salted heavily and stored. Fish, if you lived near water, could be dried or salted. Vegetables could be dried or stored in root cellars, cool underground spaces that helped slow spoilage. But preservation was imperfect. Food spoiled. Grain stored through the winter could develop mold. Salted meat could go rancid. The taste of winter food was often distinctly unpleasant by the standards of anything we would recognize today, heavily masked with whatever herbs or spices were available to cover the taste of food that was no longer quite fresh. For ordinary peasants, spices were expensive luxuries. Salt was the primary seasoning, and it was not cheap either. By midwinter, the stored food from the autumn was running low. The months between February and the first spring harvest, usually April or May, were known in some parts of England as the hungry gap, or the starving time. This was not a metaphor. People genuinely went hungry during these months. Not starvation in many cases, but a sustained, grinding shortage of food that left people weak and tired, more vulnerable to illness, less able to work effectively. Children were particularly vulnerable, the elderly too. A bad harvest in autumn, or a harsh winter that depleted stored food faster than expected, could tip a community from ordinary hardship into genuine famine. Medieval famines were not rare events. They happened regularly across the period. The Great Famine of 1315 to 1322, for example, killed perhaps 10 to 15% of the population of Northern Europe. But smaller, local famines, quieter disasters that left no great historical record, happened throughout the medieval period with a regularity that would be absolutely unthinkable in the modern developed world. Let us walk out of the village now. Let's follow one of the peasant farmers as he heads out to the fields in the early morning. The sun just barely risen, the light thin and pale and grey. He is dressed simply. A rough linen shirt worn directly against the skin. Over that, a tunic made of coarse wool, belted at the waist. On his legs, woolen hose, tied to the belt with laces. On his feet, simple leather shoes, or sometimes wooden-soled clogs, depending on the region and the period. No socks in the modern sense. His clothing is not clean, not in the way we would understand cleanliness. It is never clean, really. Laundry in the medieval world was an enormous labor. Water had to be fetched from a well or a stream, heated over the fire. used to soak and scrub garments, then rinsed and dried. This process took most of a day and could only realistically be done in warm weather. Most families washed their clothes a few times a year. In between washings, the clothes were worn continuously, slept in, worked in, worn through rain and mud and everything else. The fields around the village are organized according to a system that is almost completely alien to modern eyes. There are no neat rectangular fields separated by hedges and fences, the kind of agricultural landscape we are more familiar with. Instead, there is an open field system. Large, unfenced expanses of land divided into long, narrow strips, each strip belonging to a different family or owing dues to different lords. The same family might have strips scattered across multiple fields, and the fields themselves rotate between different uses each year, one growing winter grain, one growing spring grain, one lying fallow and being grazed by the village cattle to recover its fertility. This system was not designed for efficiency. It evolved over centuries as a compromise between competing needs and competing claims. It was familiar, it worked after a fashion, but it was also deeply inefficient, and it tied peasant families to the land in ways that made innovation and adaptation extremely difficult. The farmer is going to work in these fields today. His tools are simple, heavy, awkward, and nothing like the precise engineered equipment that would eventually transform agriculture. A wooden plow, perhaps fitted with an iron tip, pulled by oxen if he is lucky enough to own or share a team of oxen, dragged by hand if he is not. A spade, a hoe, a sickle for harvest. These tools are difficult to use. They require enormous physical effort. Plowing a field with a heavy ox-drawn plow, fighting the soil, steering the animals, keeping the furrow straight, is exhausting work, and it goes on all day, from first light to last light, through whatever the weather happens to be doing, which in Northern Europe in most seasons means some combination of cold, mud, rain, and wind. The physical toll of this kind of work on the human body is almost impossible to overstate. Archaeological analysis of skeletons from medieval peasant burials tells a very clear story. The bones show the effects of sustained heavy labor from a young age. Vertebrae compressed and deformed from carrying heavy loads. Joints worn down by years of hard physical work. Muscle attachment points enlarged and thickened from the constant strain. Many medieval peasants had serious arthritis by what we would consider middle age. Back problems were endemic. Injuries from farm work, from the tools, from the animals were common, and treatment for these injuries, when it existed at all, was primitive by any standard we would recognize. Medical knowledge in the medieval period was a mixture of genuine observation and elaborate theory that often bore very little relationship to how the human body actually functioned. The dominant medical system was based on the idea of the four humours, an ancient Greek framework that held that the human body contained four fundamental fluids: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, and that health depended on keeping these in proper balance. When the balance was disturbed, illness followed. Treatment therefore aimed at restoring the balance, which might mean bloodletting, to reduce an excess of blood, or purging, to eliminate excess bile, or applying hot or cold treatments, depending on the nature of the imbalance. These treatments were at best useless and at worst actively harmful. Bloodletting, which was performed with remarkable frequency for an enormous range of conditions, weakened already sick patients and did nothing to address the actual causes of their illness. The people who provided medical care were a varied group. Learned physicians, trained at universities that were beginning to emerge in the 12th and 13th centuries, were expensive and available only to the wealthy. In rural communities, medical care was more likely to come from a local woman known for her knowledge of herbs and remedies, or from the village priest, or from nobody at all. The medicinal herb garden was a real and important feature of medieval life, and many herbal remedies had genuine value. Willow bark, which contains salicylic acid, the active ingredient in aspirin, was used to reduce fever. Various plants with genuine antimicrobial properties were used to treat wounds. But the knowledge was fragmentary and inconsistent, and serious illness or injury in the medieval world was, by modern standards, a very frightening thing to face. Infectious disease was the great invisible killer of the medieval world. Without any understanding of germ theory, without any concept of how diseases actually spread, medieval people were entirely helpless against epidemic illness. They could not isolate the sick effectively because they did not know that isolation was the appropriate response. They could not sterilize contaminated water because they did not know that water carried disease. They could not avoid infected vectors because they did not know what vectors were. The result was that epidemic disease moved through medieval communities with an ease and speed that is almost incomprehensible today. The most dramatic example, of course, is the Black Death, the bubonic plague that swept through Europe between 1347 and 1351, killed somewhere between 1/3 and 1/2 of the entire population of the continent. Perhaps 25 million people, perhaps more, died in those 4 years. In some regions, the death toll was even higher. Entire villages were emptied. Communities that had existed for centuries ceased to exist within months. The speed and scale of the dying was unlike anything that had ever happened in recorded European history, and the psychological impact on the survivors was profound and lasting. But the Black Death, as catastrophic as it was only the most dramatic instance of a much more general vulnerability to infectious disease that shaped medieval life continuously. Long before the Black Death, epidemic illness visited medieval communities regularly. Smallpox, typhus, dysentery, influenza, tuberculosis, which the medieval world called consumption, was endemic. A slow and wasting disease that killed gradually, draining its victims of strength and breath over months or years. Malaria was present in parts of England well into the medieval period, particularly in low-lying marshy areas. Ergotism, caused by a fungal contamination of rye grain, could sweep through communities that depended on rye bread, causing convulsions, hallucinations, and in severe cases, gangrene. Because the source of ergotism was not understood, it was attributed to supernatural causes, to curses or divine punishment, and the treatments applied were accordingly ineffective. The life expectancy figures for the medieval period are striking. Average life expectancy at birth in medieval Europe was probably somewhere between 30 and 40 years, but this number is heavily influenced by the extraordinarily high rate of infant and child mortality. Children in the medieval world died in very large numbers. Perhaps 1/4 to 1/3 of all children died before their 5th birthday. Childhood diseases that are now prevented by vaccines, measles, whooping cough, diphtheria, killed children with great frequency. Malnutrition weakened immune systems and made children far more vulnerable to illnesses that healthy, well-fed children might survive. If you survived childhood, your prospects improved somewhat, but they were still nothing like those of a person living in the modern developed world. A medieval adult who reached the age of 20 could perhaps expect to live to their mid-40s or 50s if they were lucky and reasonably healthy. Illness, injury, and the cumulative effects of hard physical labor meant that the bodies of medieval adults aged much faster than ours do. Let us think now about water. Clean water, safe water. In the modern world, water comes from a tap, and we expect it to be safe to drink without any further thought. The infrastructure that makes this possible, the treatment plants, the pipes, the testing and monitoring systems, is so thoroughly embedded in modern life that most people simply do not think about it at all. In the medieval world, there was no such infrastructure. Water came from wells, from streams and rivers, from ponds and springs, and these sources of water were not clean, not even close. In a medieval village, the same streams that provided drinking water also received the waste products of human and animal life. Latrines, when they existed, were simple pits dug in the ground, often not far from the well. Animal waste from the farm animals kept in and around the houses was ubiquitous. The connection between contaminated water and illness was not understood because the germ theory of disease was still 6 centuries in the future. The result was that waterborne illness was extremely common. Dysentery, which causes severe and debilitating diarrhea, was endemic in medieval communities. Typhoid fever, spread through contaminated water and food, killed regularly. Cholera, though the great cholera pandemics are more associated with the early modern and industrial period, was a threat wherever water supplies were contaminated. Intestinal parasites of various kinds were extraordinarily widespread. Analysis of the contents of medieval cesspits has found the eggs of roundworms, whipworms, and other intestinal parasites in virtually every sample studied. These parasites were not merely unpleasant. They competed with their hosts for nutrition, contributing to malnutrition in people who were already not eating enough, and compromising immune systems that were already under strain from other sources. Hygiene, in the modern sense of the word, was essentially absent from medieval life. Not because medieval people were stupid or didn't care about cleanliness, but because the means of achieving cleanliness were so difficult and expensive that true cleanliness was simply not a realistic option for most people. Soap existed and was used by people who could afford it, but soap was expensive to make, and the process of making it required fat and wood ash lye, and a good deal of time and labor. Most peasant families could not afford to use soap regularly. Washing the body thoroughly required heating large quantities of water, which required fuel, which was scarce and valuable. Bathing, in the sense of submerging the body in water, happened rarely for most medieval people. Not once a week, not once a month. A few times a year perhaps. Some people washed their hands and face more regularly, but a full bath was an occasion rather than a routine. The consequences of this for the lived experience of daily life are not difficult to imagine. People smelled. They smelled of sweat, of the animals they worked with, of the smoke from the fire, of the clothes they wore day after day without washing. The sense of smell, which is so closely connected to memory and atmosphere, would have experienced medieval life very differently from the way we experience it now. The smells that we associate with uncleanliness and discomfort were simply the background smell of existence. You cannot miss what you have never had, but it is worth pausing to let that reality settle in gently, the way all of these details are settling in for us tonight, slowly and without urgency. Lice were universal in the medieval world. Head lice, body lice, the kind of lice that live in clothing and come out at night to feed. Archaeological evidence of lice has been found at virtually every medieval site where the right conditions for preservation existed. Lice combs, with their fine teeth designed to remove lice and their eggs from hair, are among the most commonly found personal grooming implements from the medieval period. Fleas were equally universal. Medieval houses, with their earthen floors and thatched roofs and resident animals, were ideal environments for fleas. The relationship between flea bites and the spread of the plague bacterium was not understood in the medieval period, but it was the infected fleas on the rats that brought the Black Death into human communities in 1347. We have been talking for a while now about the physical difficulties of medieval life, the cold, the hunger, the illness, the labor, and all of that is important and real. But I want to spend some time now on something slightly different. on the social world of the medieval peasant, on the invisible structures of power and obligation that shaped their lives just as surely as the cold and the hunger did. Because medieval life was not just physically hard. It was hard in a structural way, in a way that was built into the social order itself, and that made it extremely difficult for ordinary people to improve their circumstances in any meaningful way. The medieval social structure was feudal, not quite uniformly feudal everywhere and at all times, because the reality was always more complicated and varied than any simple description can capture, but broadly organized around a hierarchy of obligation and authority that placed ordinary farming people at the bottom and gave them very little control over their own lives. At the very top of this hierarchy was the king, whose authority derived from God, or so the theory went. Below the king were the great nobles, the dukes and earls and counts, who held their lands from the king in exchange for military service and loyalty. Below them were lesser nobles, knights and lords of manors, who held their lands from the great nobles in similar arrangements. And at the bottom, making up the vast majority of the population, were the peasants. Peasants in the medieval period were not a single uniform category. There were gradations, from relatively prosperous free peasants who owned their own tools and animals and owed limited duties to their lords, down to serfs or villeins who were legally bound to the land and to the lord who owned it, and who occupied a position that, while not quite slavery in the classical sense, was extremely far from freedom as we would understand it. A serf could not leave the manor without the lord's permission. A serf could not marry without the lord's permission. A serf owed the lord specific amounts of labor on the lord's land, the domain, typically 2 or 3 days a week throughout the year, more at harvest time. This labor, called week work, was the foundation of the feudal economic system, the mechanism by which the lord extracted value from his land without having to work it himself. Imagine what this meant in practice. You are a serf farmer with perhaps 12 or 15 acres of land, enough to feed your family if the harvest is good and the winter is not too harsh. But you also owe your lord 3 days of work every week on his land, the best land on the manor, the land he reserves for himself. So of the available working days of the week, you give 3 to him for nothing, and you have the remaining days to work your own land, to maintain your house, to gather fuel, to tend your animals, to do all the other tasks that keeping your family alive requires. During the harvest, when every day of good weather matters enormously, you are still required to harvest the Lord's fields first, before your own. If the weather breaks before your harvest is in, that is your problem, not the Lord's. On top of the week work, there were other dues and obligations. A payment called heriot was due to the lord when a serf died, typically the best animal the family owned, a cow or an ox. Merchet was a payment required when a serf's daughter married, essentially a fee for permission to marry. Tallage was a tax the lord could levy at will, without any fixed limit. The mill where the peasants ground their grain was typically owned by the lord, and peasants were required to use it and pay a toll on the grain they ground there. The oven where bread was baked might also be the lord's, requiring another payment. The fishing rights in the local streams belonged to the lord. The hunting rights in the forests belonged to the lord. The wood for building and fuel came from the lord's forest and could only be taken under specific, limited circumstances. This system is not simple to describe because it varied enormously from place to place and period to period. But its general shape, the sense of endless obligation flowing upward from those who had least to those who had most, is consistent and important. Medieval peasants were not simply unfortunate in material terms. They were trapped by legal obligations that bound them to the land, by dues and payments that took a significant portion of everything they produced. by a social and religious ideology that told them their position in life was divinely ordained and that attempts to change it were not just futile but sinful. The church played a profound role in medieval life, and it is impossible to understand that life without understanding the church's presence in it. Religion was not a Sunday morning activity for medieval people. It was the all-encompassing framework through which the entire world was understood. The cycles of the agricultural year were marked by religious festivals. The stages of human life, birth and marriage and death, were all managed and sanctified by the church. The church calendar, with its saints' days and its seasons of fasting and feasting, organized time itself in medieval Europe. For peasants, the church offered things of genuine value. It offered community, the gathering together of the village on Sundays and feast days. It offered comfort in the face of the enormous uncertainties of medieval life. When your child is dying and you cannot stop it, when the harvest has failed and you don't know how you will feed your family through the winter, when you yourself are sick and frightened, the promise that this suffering has meaning, that it is part of a divine plan, that there is a better world waiting beyond this one, is not nothing. It is, in fact, very much something. But the church was also an institution with its own interests, its own hierarchy, its own claims on peasant labor and resources. The tithe, a tax of 1/10 of everything produced, was owed to the church. In theory, this was 1/10 of income. In practice, it was often taken in grain, in animals, in whatever form the local priest could extract it. The priest himself, the village priest, was often not a learned or impressive figure. He was typically someone from the local community who had received enough education to perform the basic liturgical functions, to say Mass, to administer the sacraments, but who might be barely more literate than his parishioners and who shared their poverty and their daily struggles. He preached in Latin, a language that virtually none of his congregation understood, and then translated, or more often paraphrased, the sermon into the local vernacular. The theological nuances that exercised the great minds of medieval scholarship were essentially invisible at the parish level. The religious life of ordinary medieval people was a blend of official church teaching and much older folk beliefs that the church had never entirely succeeded in suppressing. The saints, hundreds of them, each associated with particular ailments or concerns, functioned in popular religion almost as localized supernatural helpers, divine beings who could be petitioned for specific kinds of assistance. If your child was sick, you might pray to Saint Blaise, who was associated with throat ailments, or make a pilgrimage to a local holy well or shrine. If you needed rain for your crops, there were specific prayers and rituals for that. If you wanted to know whether the coming harvest would be good or bad, there were folk methods of divination, ways of reading signs in the natural world that the church officially condemned, but that persisted in rural communities for centuries. Fear was a significant component of the medieval religious experience. Fear of hell, which was vividly and graphically depicted in church art, in the tympana above cathedral doors, and in the painted walls of parish churches. Fear of purgatory, the intermediate state of suffering where most souls were believed to spend time being purified before reaching heaven. Fear of dying without receiving the last rites, which would leave the soul in a spiritually precarious position. These fears were not manipulative inventions of a cynical institution, or not entirely. They were genuine expressions of a worldview that took the reality of the supernatural entirely seriously and that placed enormous weight on the condition of the soul after death. The idea of death itself was far more present in medieval life than it is in most modern Western lives. Death was everywhere. Children died. Young people died. People died of illnesses that today would be minor inconveniences. The bodies of the dead were washed and prepared for burial by members of the family, not by professional funeral workers. The dead were buried in the churchyard, close to the village, close to the lives of the living. Memento mori, the Latin phrase meaning remember that you will die, was not a morbid affectation, but a practical piece of advice that was deeply embedded in medieval culture. You were supposed to remember your death. You were supposed to keep it in mind, to let it orient your behavior, to let it remind you that this life was temporary and the next one permanent. Let us slow down a little now. Let us walk more gently through this world we have been visiting tonight. We have talked about many difficult things, cold houses and hungry winters, and exhausting work and illness and fear. And all of it is real and true and worth understanding. But there is also a quieter side to this world, a side that is simply the texture of daily life, the unremarkable details that filled the hours and that were neither miserable nor joyful, but simply present. Think of the sound of the fire in a medieval house in the evening, after the work of the day is done and the family has gathered inside. The fire is the center of everything. Its sound is the sound of warmth, the soft crackle and occasional pop of burning wood, the quieter, more continuous hiss of peat or compressed turf, which burns longer and slower than wood and was the primary fuel in many parts of the British Isles where wood was scarce. The fire fills the room with an orange light that moves and shifts with the draft from the poorly sealed walls. The shadows in the room are deep and soft. They move. In the evening, in the firelight, people do things. Women spin thread using a spindle and distaff, or perhaps a simple wheel, the rhythmic motion of the hand keeping the thread even and consistent. This is not occasional work. This is hours of work every evening, because the household needs thread to weave into cloth and cloth to make into clothing, and all of it, every piece of fabric in the house, has been made from raw fiber by the hands of the women in the household. Men might repair tools, sharpen blades, mend harnesses, work on the small practical maintenance tasks that a farming household constantly generates. Children might be put to bed early, wrapped in their blankets on the sleeping platform or the floor, their small bodies radiating warmth. Stories are told in the evenings, not written stories, not books, but oral stories, told and retold by whoever in the community had the gift for telling them. Local legends, tales of saints and their miracles, ghost stories, because belief in ghosts and the restless dead was widespread and sincere in medieval communities. Practical wisdom passed down through narrative, stories that illustrated the right way to behave, the dangers of certain kinds of pride or greed, the rewards of patience and humility. This oral tradition was the primary carrier of culture in communities where literacy was rare. It was fragile, dependent on the memories of the people who carried it, and it changed with every telling, adapting to the circumstances of the community that held it. The nights in a medieval village are genuinely dark. There are no streetlights. There are no lit windows casting rectangles of light onto the ground outside. The only light is the moonlight, when there is a moon, and the very faint starlight. In a world without light pollution, the stars are extraordinary. The Milky Way is clearly visible. The sky is thick with stars in a way that almost nobody in the modern developed world ever sees anymore. But this beauty is abstract comfort on a cold, dark night when you need to go outside for any reason. The darkness is disorienting. It is easy to lose your footing, to stumble on the uneven ground of the village track, to become confused about direction and distance. Going outside at night was something people did as little as possible. Inside, the family settles towards sleep. The fire is banked for the night, reduced to a slow-burning core that will hold through until morning if tended carefully. The tallow candle, if one has been burning, is snuffed out. The room is very dark. The sounds of the night settle in around the house. Wind, rain, perhaps, on the thatch. Somewhere, an owl. the sounds of the animals in their stall at the far end of the building. If the house is a longhouse with animals and people sharing the same structure, which was common in some regions and periods, the breathing of the family slowing towards sleep, the warmth of bodies close together in the cold room. This is the rhythm of medieval life, this cycle of rising before dawn, of hard physical work through the day, of simple food eaten in exhaustion, of evenings by the fire, of sleep in darkness. Day after day, week after week, through the turning of the seasons, spring ploughing and planting, summer tending and weeding, autumn harvest, long days of intensive labor to bring in the grain before the weather broke, everything depending on getting it done in time. Winter, the slow drawing in, the careful management of stored food and fuel, the waiting for the days to lengthen again. The seasons meant everything in the medieval world. They were not simply changes in temperature and light. They were the organizing principle of existence, the rhythm that everything else was built around. The agricultural calendar was also the religious calendar, and both were expressions of the same fundamental truth that medieval people lived by, which is that the world moved in cycles, that everything was seasonal, that patience and endurance were the central virtues of a life well lived. We haven't talked yet about the very old. In a world where life expectancy was so much lower than our own, old age was genuinely unusual. Most people did not reach what we would consider elderly, but some did. Some people in every generation lived into their 60s or 70s, and a few lived longer. These old people occupied an interesting position in medieval society. They were holders of accumulated knowledge and experience in a world where such knowledge had to be carried in human memory rather than recorded in books. They knew which fields drained badly, which winters had been worst, which remedies had worked for which ailments. They remembered the great events of their lifetime, the years of famine or epidemic, the passage of armies through the district, the building of the new church tower. They were, in a real sense, the living library of the community. Old age in the medieval world was physically hard. The accumulated effects of a lifetime of heavy labor made chronic pain a normal feature of later life. Arthritis, joint problems, back problems were essentially universal among surviving elderly people. There was nothing effective available for pain relief. Willow bark tea could reduce fever and had some mild analgesic effect. Various herbal preparations were used. Prayer and the application of holy relics were also considered effective treatments. But the pain was essentially unmanageable in any meaningful way, and people lived with it, as they lived with so many things in the medieval world, with a matter-of-fact endurance that is both impressive and heartbreaking when you think about it. The role of women in the medieval world deserves careful attention. Women's lives in the Middle Ages were shaped by legal subordination, by the demands of marriage and childbirth, and by the constant labor of maintaining a household. But they were also lives of real agency and real significance within the limited sphere that the social order assigned to them. Women managed the household economy, and this was not a trivial responsibility. Deciding how the stored food would be allocated through the winter, managing the chickens and perhaps a kitchen garden, producing all the cloth and clothing the family wore, preserving food in autumn, managing the fire and the cooking and the cleaning. All of this fell primarily to women, and doing it well or badly made an enormous difference to the family's welfare. The concept of a housewife, in its original medieval sense, was someone with real skills and real authority within a specific domain. Childbirth was the great danger that shadowed every woman's adult life. Maternal mortality was high. The statistics are difficult to recover precisely, but something like 1 in 20 to 1 in 50 pregnancies resulted in the death of the mother, which across a lifetime of multiple pregnancies added up to a significant lifetime risk. The risks were heightened by poor nutrition, which led to deficiencies that complicated labor, by the absence of any effective intervention when labor went wrong, and by the infection risk of childbirth conducted in unsterile conditions, attended by women who had no understanding of the connection between cleanliness and infection. Women in the medieval world were well aware that pregnancy and childbirth were dangerous. It was part of the framework within which they lived their lives. The prayers for pregnant women and new mothers were among the most earnest and heartfelt of any in the medieval liturgical tradition. The children who were born into this world, if they survived the extreme vulnerabilities of infancy, began to work early. Not in the exploitative industrial sense that we associate with the word child labor, but simply in the organic sense that children in agricultural communities have always helped with the work around them. Small children scared birds from the newly planted fields. Older children tended animals on the common land. By their early teens, children were essentially adult members of the workforce, expected to contribute their full share to the household economy. Childhood, as a protected period of play and education and development, did not really exist in the medieval sense that we understand it today. Not for peasant children, not for most children at all. Education was a luxury. Literacy was limited largely to the clergy, to members of the aristocracy, and to a small and growing number of merchants and professionals in the developing towns of the high medieval period. The idea that every person should be able to read and write, that literacy was a basic requirement of full participation in society, was simply not part of the medieval world's thinking. Knowledge was transmitted orally, in apprenticeships, in the accumulated practical wisdom of communities and families. The small amount of formal education that existed was primarily oriented toward training clergy, and later, toward the needs of an increasingly complex commercial world. In the towns, which were growing and multiplying through the high medieval period, but which still housed only a small fraction of the total population, life was somewhat different from the village life we have been describing. Towns offered more variety, more economic opportunity, more social complexity. They also offered more concentrated disease, more social conflict, more crowding, and more noise. Medieval towns were not pleasant places by modern standards. The streets were narrow and unpaved, running with mud and waste. Animals were kept and slaughtered in the streets. The smells were intense. The sounds of a medieval town, the calls of street vendors, the hammering from smithies and workshops, the squealing of pigs, the ringing of church bells, were constant and overwhelming during the day. But towns also had something that villages often lacked: the possibility of social mobility. A skilled craftsperson in a medieval town could, through talent and hard work and a reasonable degree of luck, join a guild, build up a business, acquire some property, achieve a modest prosperity that was simply not available to a serf farmer bound to his lord's manor. The guilds, the associations of craftspeople and merchants that organized urban economic life, were closed and hierarchical institutions with their own internal power structures and exclusions. But they offered a pathway to economic stability and social respectability that was genuinely meaningful. We have traveled far tonight, through the cold fields and the small dark houses, through the hungry winters and the hard work and the illness and the fear, through the firelit evenings and the sounds of the medieval night. And perhaps you are beginning to feel the weight of all this history settling gently over you, like a very heavy blanket, warm and calming in its way, pulling you down toward sleep. There is so much more that could be said about the wars that periodically swept through medieval communities, bringing destruction and requisitioning and forced service, about the specific textures of poverty in different regions and different centuries, about the small pleasures that did exist in medieval life, the festivals, the music, the beer, the community, the genuine pleasures of a world that was slower and quieter and more directly connected to the natural world than our own. About the ways in which medieval people were fully human in ways that their material circumstances cannot quite capture, capable of joy and humor and love and creativity in the midst of circumstances that we would find unbearable. But we don't need to cover all of that tonight. Tonight, we have done enough. We have walked through the medieval world at a slow and steady pace. We have felt the cold of the medieval morning and the warmth of the medieval fire. We have tasted, in our imagination, the plain and often insufficient food of the medieval table. We have seen the fields and the animals and the small dark houses. We have heard the wind in the thatch and the breathing of sleeping children. And now it is time to let all of that recede. To let the medieval world grow quieter and more distant, like a landscape seen through fog that is slowly thickening. The small dark houses are growing indistinct. The fields are fading into grey. The sounds are growing softer. The cold is becoming less present. You are here. You are warm. You are safe. You are lying in a comfortable place in the modern world, with all its lights and warmth and abundance. And that is a remarkable thing when you think about it. A remarkable thing that most of the people who have ever lived on this earth did not have. The comfort you are feeling right now, right in this moment, is something extraordinary, and you can simply rest in it. Let your breathing slow down a little. Let your body feel heavier and more relaxed. Let the thoughts that have been moving through your mind begin to slow, like water moving from a fast stream into a wide, quiet pool. The images from the medieval world, the fields and the fires and the faces, can float gently through your mind like leaves on that slow water, without urgency, without demand. There is nothing you need to do. There is nowhere you need to go. There is no question that needs to be answered tonight. The medieval world is 1,000 years away, and it will still be there tomorrow if you want to think about it more. Right now, the only thing that matters is this breath, and this one, and the one after that. Each one a little slower, each one a little deeper. The darkness behind your eyes is very soft and very dark, like the darkness of a medieval night seen from inside a warm room, like the darkness that settles over a village when the fire is banked and the candle is snuffed and the family is gathered together for sleep. A darkness that is not frightening, but simply quiet, simply restful, simply the world growing still. You can let your mind move through whatever quiet thoughts are arising now, or you can let your mind go blank if it wants to. Both are fine. Both are exactly right. The story is over for tonight. The history is done. What remains is just this: the warmth, the quiet, the dark, the slow and steady rhythm of your own breathing, carrying you gently, without hurry, into sleep. Good night. Rest well.